The first thing I remember after 3 months of darkness was the smell of disinfectant and the steady beeping of machines. My eyes fluttered open to fluorescent lights that seemed impossibly bright, and for a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or why my body felt like it belonged to someone else. "She's awake," a voice whispered, but it wasn't the voice I expected to hear. I turned my head slowly, painfully, expecting to see Robert's familiar face, his worried brown eyes, his graying beard, the wedding ring that matched mine. Instead, I saw my neighbor Mrs. Henderson, her face streaked with tears and something else I couldn't quite place. Guilt, perhaps. "Where's Robert?" I whispered, my voice barely a rasp. Mrs. Henderson's face crumpled, and she looked toward the door as if hoping someone else would walk through it to answer my question. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, and suddenly I knew. Even before she spoke, I knew that the world I had fallen asleep to 3 months ago no longer existed. "Margaret, honey," she began, her voice breaking, "there's something you need to know." The words that followed hit me like a physical blow. Robert had filed for divorce 2 weeks after my accident. He'd moved out of our home. And yesterday, he'd married my sister Claire in a small ceremony at the courthouse. I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting them over and over, because counting was easier than processing the impossible truth that my husband of 32 years and my sister, my only living family, had betrayed me while I lay unconscious, fighting for my life. The machines around me started beeping frantically as my heart rate spiked, and nurses rushed in to check my vitals. But no machine could measure the shattering of a soul, and no medication could heal what had been broken while I slept. To understand the depth of this betrayal, you need to know what we were before everything fell apart. Robert and I met when I was 21, fresh out of college and working as a librarian in our small town. He was 25, a carpenter with gentle hands and dreams of building our own house someday. We were married within 2 years, and for 3 decades, we built a life that felt as solid as the oak table he crafted for our first anniversary. Claire was my baby sister, 8 years younger, and I had practically raised her after our parents died in a car accident when she was 16. I was already married then, and Robert and I didn't hesitate to take her in. She lived with us through her senior year of high school, and even after she moved out for college, our home remained her safe harbor. Every Sunday, Claire would join us for dinner. She'd help me in the kitchen while Robert watched football, and we'd laugh about her latest dating disasters or job interviews. She was the maid of honor at our wedding, and I was hers at both of her previous marriages, neither of which lasted more than 3 years. "I'm just not built for marriage like you are, Maggie," she used to say, shaking her head with that self-deprecating smile I loved so much. Robert adored Claire too, in the way a protective older brother might. When her second husband left her for his secretary, Robert spent an entire weekend helping her move out of their apartment and setting up her new place. When she struggled financially between jobs, we helped with her rent, never asking questions or expecting repayment. Our home was the center of family gatherings. Every holiday, birthday, and celebration happened around our dining room table. Claire would bring wine and stories, Robert would grill whatever was in season, and I would orchestrate the chaos with the joy of someone who had found her purpose in bringing people together. We were childless by choice, a decision we'd made early in our marriage after several heartbreaking miscarriages convinced us that perhaps we were meant to pour our parental love into Claire instead. She was our family, our legacy, the person we trusted most in the world. Looking back now, I can see how perfect it all seemed, how comfortable we'd all become in our roles. Robert, the steady provider and protector. Me, the nurturer and peacemaker. And Claire, the beloved younger sister who could do no wrong in our eyes. The first sign should have been Claire's 40th birthday party. I spent weeks planning it, wanting to make it special because she'd been going through a rough patch after losing her job at the marketing firm. I decorated our backyard with string lights, hired a caterer, and invited all her friends from college and work. But the night of the party, I noticed something I'd never seen before. Claire was sitting on our porch swing with Robert, and they were talking in low, intimate voices. When I approached with a piece of cake for her, they both went quiet in a way that felt wrong. Claire's laugh sounded forced, and Robert wouldn't meet my eyes. "What were you two conspiring about?" I asked playfully, but neither of them smiled. "Just work stuff," Robert said quickly. Claire was asking about construction opportunities. It was plausible enough. Claire had been considering a career change. But something about the way they looked at each other lingered in my mind like a discordant note in a familiar song. Then there were the phone calls. Claire started calling the house more often, but when I answered, she'd seem disappointed. "Oh, hi Maggie. Is Robert around?" It began to feel like I was an obstacle between them rather than the bridge that connected them. I noticed Robert staying late at job sites more frequently, coming home after dinner with apologies about difficult clients and unexpected problems. When I suggested he invite his work crew over for a barbecue like we used to do, he brushed off the idea. "Too busy right now, Maggie. Maybe next month." Claire started canceling our traditional Saturday shopping trips. "Sorry, sis, I have to work," became her standard excuse, even though I knew she was between jobs. When I offered to help her financially again, she seemed almost irritated by the suggestion. "I'm fine, Margaret. I don't need your help with everything." The way she said my full name instead of Maggie stung more than her words. We'd always been each other's closest confidant, but suddenly, I felt like I was bothering her by caring too much. The strangest incident happened just 2 weeks before my accident. I came home early from the library because I wasn't feeling well, and I found Robert and Claire in our living room, sitting far apart on the couch like guilty teenagers. Claire's face was flushed, and Robert jumped up so quickly he knocked over his coffee cup. "Claire was just upset about the job search," he explained, rushing to clean up the spill. I was giving her some advice. But Claire wasn't crying, and the tension in the room felt electric rather than sorrowful. They both insisted nothing was wrong, that I was overthinking things, that the stress of my recent promotion at the library was making me paranoid. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was seeing problems where none existed. Maybe the feeling that I was slowly becoming an outsider in my own family was just my imagination. After all, these were the two people I trusted most in the world. The two people who had never given me a reason to doubt their loyalty. How foolish I was to ignore the evidence of my own instincts. How desperately I wanted to believe that love and trust were enough to keep us safe from the very human capacity for betrayal. It was a Tuesday morning in October when everything changed. I remember because I was excited about the new children's reading program we were launching at the library, and I'd gotten up early to review my presentation one more time. Robert had already left for a job site across town, kissing my forehead absently as he grabbed his coffee and keys. The rain had started during the night, making the roads slick and treacherous. I was driving the familiar route to work, thinking about which books would be best for the kindergarten group, when a delivery truck ran a red light at the intersection of Maple and 3rd. They tell me the impact through my car 30 feet. That the paramedics had to use the jaws of life to extract me from the wreckage. That I was unconscious before the ambulance even arrived. But I don't remember any of that. What I remember is a strange floating sensation like being suspended in warm water. Sometimes I could hear voices, distant and unclear like radio stations fading in and out of range. I remember thinking I was dreaming, that any moment I would wake up in my own bed with Robert beside me and sunlight streaming through our bedroom curtains. The coma, they explained later, was medically necessary. My brain had swollen from the trauma, and the only way to give it time to heal was to keep me in an induced sleep. 3 months, they said. 3 months of darkness while the world continued spinning without me. But even in that darkness, some part of me was aware. I could sense when someone was in the room, could feel the difference between the gentle touch of nurses checking my vitals and the desperate grip of someone holding my hand. In the beginning, I felt that desperate grip often. Someone was there talking to me, reading to me, begging me to wake up. "Come back to us, Maggie," a voice would whisper. "Please come back." But as weeks passed, the visits became less frequent. The desperate grip loosened. The voice that had been my anchor in the darkness began to fade until sometimes days would pass without anyone taking my hand at all. I didn't understand then what was happening in the world outside my silent room. I didn't know that Robert had hired a lawyer 3 days after my accident. I didn't know that he'd moved out of our house and in with Claire just 2 weeks later, claiming he couldn't handle the stress of visiting me every day. I didn't know that while I fought to breathe on my own, to remember my own name, to find my way back to consciousness, the 2 people I loved most were planning a future that didn't include me. In my dreams, I was still whole. In my dreams, I was still loved. In my dreams, I was still the center of a family that valued loyalty above all else. How merciful it was that I couldn't hear their conversations in those final weeks. How kind that consciousness protected me from witnessing my own erasure from their lives. The first few days after waking up were a haze of medical tests, physical therapy, and well-meaning visitors who seemed to know more about my life than I did. Mrs. Henderson had delivered the initial blow about Robert and Claire, but the full scope of their betrayal revealed itself slowly, like a Polaroid photograph developing in reverse. My friend Susan from the library came to visit on my 3rd day awake. She brought flowers and a card signed by all my colleagues, but her smile seemed forced, and she kept glancing at the door as if expecting someone unwelcome to walk through it. "Everyone's been so worried about you," she said carefully. "We've been taking turns visiting, bringing you books and magazines." "Well, until what?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Until Robert asked us to stop coming. He said the doctors recommended limiting visitors to immediate family only." But I was immediate family. I was his wife. Except apparently I wasn't anymore. The divorce papers were waiting for me when I was finally strong enough to handle legal documents. Robert had filed on grounds of irreconcilable differences, as if our 32-year marriage had simply run its course rather than being abandoned while I fought for my life. The house, our house, with the garden I'd tended for decades and the kitchen where we'd shared countless meals, was being sold. Robert had already moved out all of his belongings. Claire had helped him, according to the real estate agent who called to discuss showings. "Your sister has been very helpful during this difficult time," she said cheerfully, oblivious to the knife she was twisting in my heart. "She's been handling all the details since you've been indisposed." The bank account we'd shared was nearly empty. Robert had withdrawn most of our savings, leaving just enough to cover my medical bills and a few months of basic expenses. 32 years of combined earnings gone. But the cruelest revelation came from my physical therapist, Maria, who had been working at the hospital throughout my entire stay. She mentioned almost casually how devoted my sister had been in those early weeks. "She was here every day at first," Maria said. "Sometimes with your husband, sometimes alone. They seemed so close, supporting each other through such a difficult time. Family is everything during a crisis like this. The words hit me like a second accident. They had been here together. They had held each other while I lay unconscious. They had found comfort in each other while I fought for my life alone. When had their mutual support turned into something else? When had their shared vigil become a courtship? When had their grief over my condition become an opportunity for something I couldn't bear to name? I asked Maria when the visits had stopped, and her answer confirmed my worst fears. About 6 weeks into your stay, they started coming separately. Then less frequently. By the end, it was mainly your neighbor bringing you fresh flowers. 6 weeks. They had managed to maintain the pretense of caring for 6 weeks before their guilt gave way to their desire for each other. That night, alone in my hospital bed with only the sound of machines for company, I finally allowed myself to cry. Not the tears of physical pain or medical trauma, but the deeper, more devastating tears of a woman who had discovered that love, loyalty, and trust were luxuries she could no longer afford. I was released from the hospital on a Thursday morning with a walker, a list of medications, and nowhere to go. Mrs. Henderson had offered to let me stay in her guest room until I could figure out my next steps, and I accepted with the gratitude of someone who had learned that kindness from strangers could be more reliable than love from family. But first I needed answers. I needed to look them in the eye and understand how two people I had loved unconditionally could have betrayed me so completely. Claire was living in Robert's apartment now, an apartment I had never seen in a part of town where I'd never visited. When I called to ask if we could meet, her voice sounded strange, like she was talking to an acquaintance rather than her sister. Margaret, I don't think that's a good idea right now. You're still recovering, and this is all very complicated. Complicated, I repeated, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. You married my husband while I was in a coma, Claire. I think I deserve an explanation. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. Finally, she said, "We can meet at Murphy's Diner. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Murphy's Diner had been our place, where we'd celebrated her college graduation, where she'd cried over her failed marriages, where we'd planned surprise parties and shared secrets over coffee and pie. Now it would be the place where our sisterhood died. She was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup like it was an anchor. She looked different. Her hair was shorter, styled in a way I'd never seen before, and she was wearing makeup even though it was just an afternoon coffee. She looked like someone Robert would find attractive, I realized with a stab of pain. "You look good," she said as I settled into the booth across from her. "Considering everything." "Do I?" I asked, studying my sister's face for some sign of remorse, some indication that she understood the magnitude of what she'd done. "Because I feel like my entire life has been erased." Claire's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "Margaret, you have to understand. We never planned for this to happen. We were both so scared, so overwhelmed. We didn't know if you were ever going to wake up. So you decided to move on without me? To start a new life as if I were already dead." "It wasn't like that," she said quickly. "Robert was falling apart. He couldn't handle seeing you like that every day. He needed support, and you saw an opportunity," I finished for her. Her face flushed red, and for a moment, I saw a flash of the defiant little sister I'd raised. "You don't understand what it was like, Margaret. You were gone, but we were still here, still hurting, still trying to figure out how to live with this horrible thing that had happened. We found comfort in each other." "Comfort," I repeated. "Is that what you call it?" "We fell in love," she said quietly, and those 4 words shattered whatever hope I'd been clinging to that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. "When?" I asked. "When did you fall in love with my husband, Claire?" She couldn't meet my eyes. "It happened gradually. We were spending so much time together taking care of your affairs, dealing with the doctors." "When?" I pressed. "The night of my birthday party," she whispered. "We realized we had feelings for each other, but we didn't act on them. Not until after your accident, when we thought we might lose you forever. So my instincts had been right. That strange moment on the porch swing, the awkward tension in my living room, it had all been real. They had fallen in love under my own roof, while I cooked dinner for them and planned Claire's birthday celebration. "Did you ever love me?" I asked. "Either of you? Or was I just convenient until something better came along?" Claire finally let the tears fall. "Of course we loved you. Of course I love you. You're my sister, Margaret. You practically raised me. But love isn't always enough to fight what you feel for someone else." I looked at this woman who shared my DNA, who I had protected and nurtured and sacrificed for, and I realized I was looking at a stranger. Love, for her, was something to be discarded when it became inconvenient. Loyalty was a luxury she couldn't afford when desire presented itself. I stood up slowly, my legs still weak from months of disuse, and looked down at my sister one last time. "You're right, Claire. Love isn't always enough. But it should be everything." The months that followed were the hardest of my life, harder even than losing our parents or enduring the miscarriages that had broken my heart decades earlier. This was different because this loss was a choice. Their choice to abandon me and my choice to rebuild myself from the wreckage they'd left behind. Mrs. Henderson's guest room became my sanctuary. She never asked for rent or made me feel like a burden, and slowly I began to understand what genuine kindness looked like. It wasn't the performative care I'd thought I'd received from Robert and Claire, but something quieter, more reliable. She made me tea when I couldn't sleep, drove me to physical therapy appointments, and listened when I needed to talk without offering unwanted advice. The library offered me early retirement with full benefits, a kindness I hadn't expected but desperately needed. My colleagues had taken up a collection to help with my medical expenses and apartment deposit, and their generosity moved me to tears. These people, some of whom I barely knew outside of work, had shown me more loyalty during my crisis than my own family. I found a small apartment across town, far enough from my old neighborhood that I wouldn't accidentally encounter reminders of my former life. It was nothing like the house Robert and I had shared. No garden, no oak dining table, no memories embedded in every room. But it was mine, and that felt like a victory. Physical therapy became my meditation. Each step I took without the walker, each day I managed my pain without medication, each morning I woke up and chose to keep going felt like a small rebellion against the people who had written me off. Susan from the library became my closest friend during this time. She would visit every weekend, bringing books and gossip from work, treating me like I was still the same person I'd been before the accident. She never mentioned Robert or Claire unless I brought them up first, and she never looked at me with the pity I saw in so many other faces. "You're stronger than you know," she told me one afternoon as we sat on my small balcony watching the sunset. "What they did to you was unforgivable, but look at you. You survived a coma, you're walking again, you're building a new life. That takes incredible courage." I had never thought of myself as courageous. I had always been the nurturer, the one who took care of others, the one who smoothed over conflicts and made everyone feel comfortable. But maybe courage wasn't about being fearless. Maybe it was about being afraid and choosing to keep going anyway. I started volunteering at a literacy center teaching adults to read. Many of my students were people who had faced their own betrayals. Immigrants abandoned by family members who had promised to help them, elderly people neglected by children they had sacrificed everything to raise. We found solace in each other's company, in the shared understanding that sometimes the people closest to you are capable of the greatest cruelty. On my 53rd birthday, the first birthday I'd celebrated without Robert in 32 years, I treated myself to dinner at a nice restaurant downtown. I wore a dress I'd bought with my own money, styled my hair the way I liked it, and raised a glass of wine to my reflection in the restaurant window. "Happy birthday, Margaret," I whispered to myself. "Here's to the woman you're becoming." 22 years have passed since the accident that changed everything. I'm 75 now, and when I look back on that devastating period of my life, I can see it for what it truly was. Not an ending, but a beginning. Robert and Claire divorced after 8 years of marriage. I heard about it through mutual acquaintances, the same gossip network that had once carried news of their wedding. Apparently, Claire had an affair with her personal trainer, and Robert couldn't forgive the betrayal. The irony wasn't lost on me, though by then, it no longer brought me satisfaction. Their pain couldn't undo my own, and their karma couldn't give me back the years I'd lost to their selfishness. I never remarried, but I did fall in love again. With books, with teaching, with the garden I planted on my apartment balcony, with the quiet dignity of a life lived on my own terms. I traveled to places Robert had never wanted to visit, read authors he'd never heard of, made friends he would never have understood. My students at the literacy center became my chosen family. I watched Maria, a woman from El Salvador, read her first English novel at age 60. I celebrated with James, a veteran who had hidden his illiteracy for decades, when he finally read bedtime stories to his grandchildren. These victories felt more meaningful than any anniversary dinner or family holiday I'd ever hosted. The woman I became was stronger than the woman I had been, but also lonelier in ways I couldn't have imagined. There's a particular kind of solitude that comes from learning that the people you trusted most were capable of such betrayal. It changes how you move through the world, makes you more cautious with your heart, more protective of your peace. But it also makes you appreciate genuine kindness when you encounter it. Mrs. Henderson remained my neighbor and friend until her death 5 years ago, and I held her hand as she passed, grateful beyond words for her unexpected grace during my darkest hour. Susan and I are still close, our friendship deepened by the trials we've weathered together. I think often about trust now, about how easily we give it away and how difficult it is to rebuild once it's been shattered. I've learned that loving someone doesn't obligate them to love you back with the same intensity or loyalty. I've learned that family bonds can be broken by desire and selfishness just as easily as they can be broken by death or distance. But I've also learned that betrayal, as devastating as it is, doesn't have to define the rest of your story. You can choose to become bitter, to let the cruelty of others poison every relationship that follows. Or you can choose to become more selective, more careful, but not more closed. You can choose to honor the love you gave even if it wasn't returned in kind. If I could speak to my younger self, the woman who woke up from that coma to discover her world had been destroyed, I would tell her this: you will survive this. You will build something new from the pieces they left behind. You will discover strengths you never knew you possessed, and you will find joy in places you never thought to look. The story of your life isn't ending with their betrayal. It's just beginning with your freedom. And sometimes, when I'm reading to a new student or tending my garden or simply watching the sunset from my balcony, I feel a deep sense of gratitude for the accident that changed everything. Not for the pain it caused, but for the person it revealed me to be beneath the roles I had played for others. I am Margaret and I am enough. I always was, even when the people closest to me couldn't see it. That, perhaps, is the greatest gift betrayal gave me. The knowledge of my own worth, independent of anyone else's capacity to recognize it.